Where's Anna? Anna, thank you. I can think of no better way to celebrate the Walter Pepin Memorial Building than with what we just heard, and also with the Pepin family, and also to think of trees that are planted that people will look at 50 years from now, just like Mr. Pepin would have done. So thank you all for being with us. When this institute was founded 60 years ago, we were in the middle of a world that was torn by ethnic strife. We were facing a great global struggle against those who were against the spread of freedom. And we also had people on the fringes here at home that were tearing us apart from understanding our common values. That world may seem similar to you. Sound familiar? And that's why the Aspen Institute today still has the same surety of purpose that I think it did 60 years ago when Walter Pepin founded it. When they founded the Aspen Institute, they did so based on the principle that if all of us deeply understood and appreciated the common values that we shared, we would be able to find common ground in facing both the global challenges and our domestic problems at home. They did that, first of all, by creating the great Aspen Seminar, which then, as it does now, begins with the great values of Plato, then Sophocles' Antigone, and brings it through Jefferson and Locke, and nowadays all the way through Gandhi and Martin Luther King, to understand the type of values that we as a civilization and we as people in the world, the humanistic values that make our societies strong and that help us in the global struggle. In doing so, with that great seminar, they not only taught us to understand the great values, but they taught us something else, which was the notion of balance. It became clear at times when you take the Aspen Seminar that something like individual liberty and freedom might conflict with the good of the community or the most efficient way to run a community. And so you always had to balance those values. If there's one thing really missing in our world today and in our society today, it's an appreciation for that notion of balance. That, as Benjamin Franklin would say, compromisers may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies because they know how to balance and show respect for the different values that exist in our society. Nowadays, we try to keep that tradition here at the Aspen Institute and with all the institutions founded in Aspen 60 years ago with that Goethe convocation. And we do so, first of all, by keeping true to the spirit of the Aspen Seminar, the executive seminar. I really do invite you, any of you who want to become more involved in the Aspen Institute, to take that week-long seminar, to understand the great writings, great thoughts, great ideas of our society. And if that intimidates you, the notion of the great books, I'll tell you the little secret of what we call it on the inside, which is the great paragraphs, because it is a bit distilled. You don't have to read every one of the books. But it's a wonderful experience, and it's a foundation for what we do at the Aspen Institute. But besides this great seminar program that we have, we've started some other things, including the Aspen Global Leaders Network. That network was founded 12 years ago as the Henry Crown Program, and many of you have met many of the Crown Fellows that have come through here. Many of them have gone on to greater things. Arnie Duncan, now the Secretary of Education. But they've also each done a project. After they finish the Aspen Seminar, they do a couple of other seminars, they do bonding and leadership exercises, and they grab onto the notion of leadership based on values. And then they have to pay it forward. They have to do a project. They have to create things. And whether it's John Danner, who was just here at the Institute a couple of days ago, who created rocket ship education and some of the great charter schools in this country, or people like Peter Reiling, who works at the Institute but helped form a replica of the Crown program in Africa called the Africa Leadership Initiative. And that spawned an East Africa one. And now, because of that, because of this pay-it-forward tradition, we have programs, leadership programs around the world with 1,200 people now, whether it's in South Africa, Mozambique, and Ghana, the newest one in the Middle East, done by a great woman named Shadia, who's from Lebanon, who was a Crown Fellow, And now she's created a replica of the Crown program that has Israelis, Palestinians, Lebanese, and Jordanians all working together in projects. Likewise, we've done it in specific fields, such as education or the environment. The Cato Fellows, some of whom are still around because they had their first meeting this past week, work together in different ways to do environmental programs. But all of them have that guiding spirit that Pepka, Mortimer Adler, Hutchins, and others did 60 years ago, which is first understand the basic values, then understand how to balance them, and then understand how to apply them. That infuses to the 27 policy programs we have at the Aspen Institute. Those programs range from education environment to the Aspen Strategy Group, one of the oldest. Used to be run by Dick Lugar and Sam Nunn, which is how the Nunn-Lugar Act on nuclear proliferation came about, now run by Joe Nye and Brent Scowcroft. Looking at ways that we can rise above partisanship and help deal with the problems of the world today. But these programs are not just about talk, and one of the things we tried to do in the past 6 or 7 years as we reinvigorated the Institute is find ways to have talk lead to action. So in many of our programs, we try to apply the lessons that we've learned, and I'll take 2 examples. One of them is the Middle East and the U.S.-Palestinian issues, the Israeli-Palestinian issues and the role the U.S. can play. Not only have we been working on that problem with our Middle East Strategy Group, but we helped create the U.S.-Palestinian Partnership that eventually created a small business loan fund to give loans of $50,000 to $500,000 to businessmen in the Palestinian territories, often in collaboration with Israeli and American business leaders, so there'd be joint ventures in technology, garment manufacturing, taxi cabs, making carpets, and pharmaceuticals, so that now almost $400 million of loan guarantees are available in the Palestinian territories. That's run by Bill Mayer, Burl Bernhardt, and others, Madeleine Albright. And when the previous administration wanted to do a public-private partnership with the Palestinians and Israelis, they turned to the Aspen Institute, and Secretary Rice and President Bush created the U.S.-Palestinian Partnership that was based at the Aspen Institute. As you know, with any new administration, it takes them a while to do the same thing as the previous administration. So for about 6 months, we were in limbo. But some of you who were here earlier today at Steve Wick's talk saw the picture of Secretary Clinton as she met with myself and Madeleine Albright to have what's called the Partnership for a New Beginning. It's basically the same thing we were doing in the previous administration. They just had to rename it and take 6 months to reconstitute it. But it does mean that we can take some of the values that were planted with the trees here 60 years ago and help apply them around the world. We hope to do that in many different ways, including with an Ideas Festival in Abu Dhabi, including with the Palestinian Business Forum that we do each year in Bethlehem. All of these things are a way of saying you can take the values that are engaged in this great global struggle and apply them around the world. The other place where I want to use as an example where we turn thought into action is K through 12 education, something I believe very strongly is a need in this country. If we're going to be successful in the 21st century, as we were in the 20th, we're going to need an education system as good. In the 20th century, we had the world's best K through 12 education system. Now we're not the world's best. We have to get back there. And that will take a whole lot of new thinking of how we're going to do education in America. We've had quite a few education programs that have been run at the Aspen Institute, ranging from the Urban Superintendent's Meeting to the new Young Leadership Program, as I say, part of the Global Leaders Network, based on the Crown program, that was done by Kim Smith, who was a Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, and she created the New Schools Leadership Program for young entrepreneurial educators. That program met each year in its inaugural convening. It meets right next door in the Koch building. And 4 years ago, right after Hurricane Katrina, they were meeting, and I was there, and I said, well, if you're really serious about this, you're going to turn thought into action, you should get involved in New Orleans, which no longer has a school system after the hurricane, is about to reconstitute it. And if you're really serious, you'll move down there. And Sarah Houston, who was in that room, went down and started New Schools New Orleans. Matt Candler, who was in that room and who was an education fellow, moved with his pregnant wife down to New Orleans 6 months after the hurricane and started working with the new charter school group there. John Schnoor, who ran New Leaders, New Schools, a principals group, moved down to New Orleans from that Koch building seminar room and opened a chapter of New Leaders for New Schools, which trains principals. And Kira Orange-Jones went down to be the Teach for America leader. I'm involved with Teach for America. They had been involved in this program. They had 250 core members in New Orleans after the storm. We asked them if they wanted to stay and help reconstitute the school system. All of them did, and now there are 500 core members there. So with that group, all of which came out of a kernel of our leadership network for school entrepreneurs, they created a new school system in New Orleans, my hometown, in which more than 70% of the kids are now in charter schools started by entrepreneurs, and parents have choice. It's raised the reading and math scores by 20 points in the past 2 years, and it does show how new thinking and new types of leadership, thought leading to action, can have an impact on this world. And so in many ways, this is what I hope the legacy of the Pepka family and the Pepka tradition is, which is understanding the basic values, being engaged in the global struggle based on those values, but also putting those values into action. You know, there are two themes we try to do here at the Aspen Institute. One is leadership based on values. That comes through on every single one of our policy programs, but it's also something we try to do as we apply each of our things. So you have to go out into this world and move, to use the phrase of Keith Berwick, from just being successful to being significant, to making a dent in the universe. And the other is tolerance based on respect and understanding of other people's ideals. And those are the two values that we keep fighting for here. One of the other things we have changed at the Aspen Institute is it used to be, especially 10, 12 years ago, a rather closed place where the Aspen Strategy Group, the education, the environment groups would meet behind closed doors and just try to do it off the record and quietly. We still have those. We still have very deep drill-down sessions where people meet in 20-person conference rooms. But we also wanted to open it up because we believe that the spread of values, the meeting of people face-to-face, is another way to engage in this global struggle. And so we've taken each of our policy programs and urged them to create broader, more open forums. And that's where the Aspen Ideas Festival came about. Some of you will be here for that. It starts on July 5th. And each year, Kitty Boone and Elliot Gerson, the people who put it together, have a whole series of tracks on great ideas and ways they can be applied. But also, on Tuesday, we have another big public forum on security, American security and homeland security, beginning with Admiral Mullen, who, as you know, in the past 2 days has been in Afghanistan after the change in command there, but is coming here and will be a speaker at the Institute and at our security forum this coming week. Those are the type of things that you or anybody in the community should get involved in, come see, and I hope it will help deepen your appreciation for what can be done at the Institute. Likewise, thanks to Bonnie and Tom McCluskey, we try to do public speaker series, including people from all walks of life who have been great leaders and will be on this great new stage and at the Greenwald Pavilion over the course of the summer. And finally, I think July 25th, we have our Environment Forum. Once again, since I'm from the Gulf of Mexico area, I'm worried about the Gulf spill. But we have people ranging from Lisa Jackson, who's the Environmental Protection Agency Director, to Tom Donahue, who's the head of the Chamber of Commerce. Because people like that don't always speak together. They don't always try to find the common ground. But crises like the ones we face in energy and the environment should bring us back to the roots of finding common ground based on common values. And that Aspen Environment Forum is also open to the public as well as to participants from around the world who become coming in for some of the smaller sessions. Why do we do that in the age of the internet? People say, well, with the internet and cable TV and everything else, people can get information, they can communicate, they can even connect with one another digitally. You don't need this type of thing. I actually believe that in the internet and digital age, there's even more of a need for face-to-face, in the flesh communications. Sometimes in the digital age, on the internet, where everybody's anonymous, people can go to the different cul-de-sacs of the blogosphere, in which they only listen to people they agree with, where they stoke themselves up on the left or on the right or on different ends of the spectrum, hearing only the things they want to hear, flaming people who disagree with them. Likewise, whether it's a talk radio dial or cable TV spectrum, people congregate at their end, hearing only the type of information they want to hear. Cass Sunstein, one of the great thinkers of the internet age, has talked about how that leads to a cascading into extremism, where people don't really see each other face to face. They don't actually share values. They just interact in the blogosphere, going to get reinforced in their own opinions and anonymously making comments about people who disagree with them. So in this type of day and age, I think there's even more of a need for an ideas festival, an environment forum, a national security forum, for a speaker series, for people to come to Aspen, for people to sit around a seminar room and engage face-to-face in the flesh so that they can understand and feel and empathize with the fact that there's certain shared values that have come to us from Plato and Sophocles and Jefferson and Gandhi and King. And when they do so, they will capture that notion of tolerance that is more than just tolerating somebody else, but understanding and respecting those values of other people and figuring out how you can make the balance right, how you can have fealty to the deep values of our tradition and yet still respect and understand people and form a balance of those values as we go in the struggle ahead. I often like to quote Ben Franklin on this, not just to sell copies of the paperback of my book, but Benjamin Franklin, when he was at the Constitutional Convention, at one point they were tearing, the founders were supposed to have been these great people, but they too got in arguments like sometimes happens in Aspen. They were tearing each other apart on the big state, little state issue until Ben Franklin said, when we were young tradesmen and we were trying to get a joint of wood and had to put it together and it didn't quite fit, we'd take a little from one side and then shave a little from the other until we had a joint that would hold together for centuries. And so too we here at this convention must each part with some of our demands so we can find the common ground and common values that will make a constitution that will hold together for centuries. And since we're dedicating a new building and honoring the donors sitting up here who did it, I'll talk about his role in building committees and donations for building committees. Because during his lifetime, he donated to the building fund of each and every church and each and every meeting hall that was built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were building a new meeting hall for itinerant preachers. He wrote the fundraising document, even better than the letter most of you got from Melva Buxbaum. And it said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and we should listen, for we may learn and we might be able to find the common ground of values. And on his deathbed, he was the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. That was the type of leadership based on values and tolerance based on respect and understanding that the founders of this nation tried to instill more than 200 years ago, and that's exactly what the founders of this institute tried to instill 60 years ago. And that's what I hope, with the help of all of you, the Aspen Institute will be about now and 60 years from now. Thank you all very much.
But Gwen Chanzit, Dr. Gwen Chanzit, we're just so thrilled to have her up here with us today. She's the curator of modern and contemporary art at the Denver Art Museum and is also the curator of the Herbert Bayer collection and the archive at the Denver Art Museum. If you haven't seen the collection and you haven't seen the Denver Art Museum, please take a trip down to Denver because it's just absolutely spectacular, and Gwen's done a great job with it. She's also a faculty member at the University of Denver of Art and Art History, where she teaches modern art history and directs the graduate program in museum studies. She's organized a variety of exhibitions and has lectured and published extensively on Herbert Bayer, including this book, which is called From Bauhaus to Aspen. It's about modernist design in America. We don't have copies of this book, unfortunately.
It's Herbert Bayer.
Yeah, Herbert Bayer. We don't have copies of this right now, but if anyone's interested in getting one, we'll take a list, because we've ordered a whole bunch of them up here for the summer. So we'll take your name, and if you want to purchase one later. So we're very thrilled to have Gwen back with us today on this special occasion and to celebrate the rebirth of Herbert Bayer's original Pepke building. Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you. Is this mic on? Yes, you can hear. I can hear now. That's great. Well, I don't have any music, I'm sorry to say, but I have lots of pictures, and I hope you'll enjoy that because it's a particular pleasure to speak with you here in Aspen at this wonderful celebration. It's great that so many individuals today are committed to preserving both the spirit and the place of the Aspen Institute because, as you all know, Aspen has a unique cultural history and a cultural legacy that is being continued. And this morning I'll speak on the modernist artist designer Herbert Bayer, who was an important part of this extraordinary cultural history from its earliest days. Bayer was a pioneer in the field of 20th century art and design. He left a great legacy for later modernists, and especially for us here as the original designer of this Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies and as a founding member of the International Design Conference, Aspen. When Walter Pepke brought Bayer to this former mining town in 1946, it changed the face of Aspen and also the career of Herbert Bayer. And I think what happened here also changed the face of American art and design and its positive intersection with American business in the mid-20th century that still continues today. He was Austrian by birth, born in 1900. He studied and later was a master, a teacher at the Bauhaus in Germany, the most influential art school of the 20th century. In the late 1930s, Bayer fled Germany to make his home in the United States. He became an American citizen and spent almost 3 decades here in Aspen. Both the Ski Colorado emblem at left and the photo montage at right are by Bayer, who until his death in 1985 was the last living Bauhaus master. I should mention that unless I tell you otherwise, you can assume the images I'm showing you today are by Herbert Bayer. Now I want to start out by saying that Bayer's name is fairly well known today, but something I find very interesting is that when I meet people who know his name, they almost always associate him with one specific area of accomplishment, and of course that depends on the context in which they've come across him. Some know Bayer as a painter, others only through his enigmatic, surrealist-like photographs. It's his self-portrait of 1932 at left and the very well-known Lonely Metropolitan of the same year at right. Or they know Bayer as an avant-garde exhibition designer. He's best known by many as a graphic designer, and I want to tell you that when people went through Andy Warhol's effects after his death, they found Herbert Bayer's 1940 Harper's Bazaar magazine cover. So I'm not going to say anything more than that. And of course, this morning we were talking about the FIS activities, and that's the poster from 1950. So lots of people, and I would say that most times when I'm asked to speak before groups, it's often in the context of graphic design. Of course, in Denver, we know him very well for his articulated wall along I-25 near Denver's Design Center. And for us here in Aspen, of course, the great contributions he made here at the Aspen Institute. Regardless of the merits of any one area of his creative work, Bayer always saw each as a part of his interdisciplinary approach to art making that called on his full range of artistic abilities. And of course, Aspen is the perfect place to reflect on this interdisciplinary approach. Even in a world of specialists, and I love what we talked about earlier in that wonderful presentation that we heard about what those early guys in 1949, what they thought about specialists. But even in this world of specialists, Bayer practiced a huge range of art and design, all towards a goal of creating a unified total environment where every well-designed part is interrelated. He never let distinctions between fine and applied art get in the way of his creativity. This was the lesson that he brought from the Bauhaus. Today, as we celebrate Aspen, we remember Bayer as the original designer of this Aspen Institute campus, with buildings, murals, sculpture, all integrated within this extraordinary planned site. In building for Aspen and in all his ventures, he never categorized or ranked his creative output. For over 60 years, Bayer was active as a painter, photographer, typographer, architect, and sculptor, and as a designer of graphics, environments, exhibitions, and tapestries. There's a beautiful one outside. He himself said, quote, "I am not so much concerned with the individual work of art as with the total shape and content of the human scene." Bayer's strong commitment to bettering the world through good design came to him by way of the Bauhaus, where beginning in 1921, he was first a student and later a master, a teacher, heading up the Bauhaus's first workshop in graphic design and typography. Later, in the service of two major U.S. corporations, and of course here at the Aspen Institute, Bayer created total systems of design. He remained committed to the idea of total design to the end of his life. He died in 1985. Bayer came to the Bauhaus in 1921. That was just 2 years after the school had opened in Weimar, Germany. He left in 1928, which was the same year that Gropius, Breuer, and Moholy-Nagy also left. We remember that the Bauhaus taught there should be no distinctions between the so-called fine and applied arts, that no one art form was inherently better than any other, and that all the arts should be integrated within a unified environment, which in turn would improve the quality of modern life. We also remember that eventually Bauhaus artists sought to get away from ornament and handwritten forms that were anachronistic for the modern age. Instead, they were looking to spare, machine-inspired forms. And we can see the results of this emphasis on Bayer's own graphic design by comparing this clean Bauhaus typography that you see it left on the screen from 1925 with a very ornamented page of stationery that Bayer had designed 7 years before in 1918. That's, of course, before he came to the Bauhaus. The earlier work, of course, is very beautiful, artistically elegant, but difficult to decipher. And here's a very pretty but nondescriptive package design, again by Bayer for soap, at the right, done in 1920, the year before he came to the Bauhaus, compared with his Bauhaus design for a cigarette display at left of 1924. And you can see, of course, with that and also with his newspaper kiosk at right, that these Bauhaus functional displays that Bayer designed and his clean graphics clearly direct the consumer to the product. Bauhaus director Walter Gropius believed that instead of making independent works of art, it was very important to create total integrated systems, that all the arts could be combined within the larger context of architecture. Of course, Gropius was an architect. Bayer continually embraced the Bauhaus idea of integrating the arts into a total unified environment. In my estimation, Herbert Bayer was the only one of the Bauhaus masters who carried that philosophy into lifelong practice. More than any other Bauhaus artist who eventually specialized in one or another discipline, he spent his entire life working within the tenets of Bauhaus philosophy and practice, integrating a wide range of materials to serve his goal of improving the quality of the modern environment. His career really became a model of what the Bauhaus directives could achieve, and this Aspen Institute is absolutely the great showcase of it. For 10 years after he left the Bauhaus, from 1928 to 1938, Bayer worked in Berlin as a designer, principally of graphics and exhibitions. Then in 1938, he immigrated to the United States, where he helped shape a new era of modernism in American art and design. By 1946, he was here in Aspen, about 65 years ago, and these posters were done that year, 1946. I mentioned that Bayer was born in 1900, and I've always thought that was a very considerate thing for an artist to do, because it's always easy to know exactly how old he was at any given date. So when he died in 1985, he was 85 years old. He was born in Haag, Austria, in a very small mountain town near Linz. And when I made my own kind of pilgrimage there, I was delighted to discover a place that reminded me of early Colorado. No wonder he loved Aspen. So Bayer arrived at the Bauhaus in 1921 at the age of 21. All right, wasn't that nice of him? He also was in various places for 10 years at a time, which I also thought was kind of considerate. The Bauhaus opened his eyes to what could happen with new possibilities, and the Bauhaus really shaped his ideas about what art could do for the world. Here are a couple works he did in the 2 years before he came to the Bauhaus as a 21-year-old student who clearly showed considerable talent. He arrived in Weimar, the first home of the Bauhaus, and when we think of the Bauhaus today, we always think of very functional art and design. We think of tubular metal chairs, streamlined furniture, metalwork, hard-edge painting, and geometric design. And of course, this is what the Bauhaus became. But in fact, the school began in a very romantic spirit, and we can see this in Feininger's woodcut entitled Cathedral that accompanied the first Bauhaus proclamation in 1919. These people really saw themselves coming together in a united workforce, not unlike the medieval Craftsmen's Guild. Here is the first Bauhaus seal, looking kind of rough-cut and romantic. And the first master of the school's preliminary course was Johannes Itten, a spiritual mystic who wanted to unleash students' natural creative talents. Now, to keep mind and body ready to create, Itten prescribed two very physical and mental exercises and a macrobiotic diet. I think it was Alma Mater said the most pronounced thing about the Bauhaus was garlic on the breath because of this diet. And he always dressed in these robes and prescribed to all kinds of things like fasting and enemas and breathing exercises. But by 1923, the Bauhaus had shifted gears, and nothing demonstrated that better than Itten's replacement by the Hungarian constructivist Moholy Nagy. By the way, Bayer called him Moholy Nagy. I suppose that's the way they pronounced it when they were in Germany. And I've talked to some Hungarians who said, no, it's Moholy Nagy, something like that. Anyway, we know him as Moholy Nagy. And Moholy was a very functional, pragmatic individual who looked to new techniques and especially to new materials. Under Moholy, all metaphysics, intuition, and emotional orientation were replaced by the clean-lined works that we now associate with the Bauhaus, and by innovations like his light space modulator at left. And I wanted to show you what the later Bauhaus seal looked like by Oskar Schlemmer, no longer looking handmade, but instead very clean-lined and precise, exactly what we think of for the Bauhaus. And I mentioned this big change at the Bauhaus because I think Bayer, who arrived there before that change, always retained both sides of the Bauhaus, the early expressionist and the later functional. Bayer is best known, of course, for the clean-lined, functional work that he employed in public projects, such as he did for corporations. But he always maintained that expressive spirit that shows itself in private works, many of which were made here in Aspen, responding to the mountains, to wildlife, and the natural beauty that he thrived on here in Aspen. And of course, mind, body, and spirit have always been the tenets of the Aspen Institute. We'll look at these directions in his work in a little bit, but first I want to go back to Bayer at the Bauhaus, because this change we've just seen at the Bauhaus towards a clean-lined aesthetic was demonstrated in an exhibition in 1923 that was entitled Art and Technology, A New Unity. And this was really to show the people and the administration at Weimar what they were doing in that funny little school, because they were always suspect. And so this was an exhibition that they actually had called on. The administrative government in Weimar had called for this exhibition to show them what they were doing. So in 1923, the exhibition, Art and Technology, A New Unity. And here is Bayer's postcard for the 1923 exhibition that, of course, he did as a student. Also as a student in Kandinsky's wall painting workshop, Bayer created a series of 3 murals for that 1923 Bauhaus exhibition in the stairwell of the Bauhaus building at Weimar, and you can still go see it today. They were whitewashed over during a previous administration, I might say, but they've been recovered and restored. And these paintings respond to Bauhaus teachings, and particularly to Kandinsky's theories about the psychological relationship between color and form, specifically in the 3 primary colors and the elemental forms of the triangle, square, and circle. Kandinsky absolutely believed that a circle should be blue, that a square red, and a triangle yellow. And on each level of the stairwell, Bayer examined the relationship between one color and one form. Now, the elements and the ideas that he expressed in this very early Bauhaus work remain central to Bayer and continue to be re-examined by him throughout his life. So here's the wonderful Van de Velde building that served as the Bauhaus's first home in Weimar. And Bayer's murals are not in this main curved stairway that you see here, a beautiful stairway, but instead in a side stairway. So here from top to bottom are Bayer's 1923 stairwell murals as they appear today, with, of course, the yellow triangle, the red square. And I want to say that after all these years, the offices were relocated, and so this directional mural causes a bit of confusion today. Such is art. And the blue circle. By the time of the 1923 exhibition, the expressive early years of the Bauhaus had given way to a new emphasis on applied modern design. We can see clear, uncluttered graphics in Bayer's student work in these postcards that you've just seen one of them from the 1923 exhibition, and also in the murals. Bayer had always been interested in typography and graphic design as a student, and Gropius encouraged his interest, giving him opportunities such as the important job of designing this first Bauhaus book cover of 1923, so he's still a student. But there were no courses at that time in graphics and typography, so independently he used the small graphic print shop. He conceived an ideal alphabet while he was still a student, and in 1925, he created his universal type. And by the way, you can get this for your computer, but it's not universal, which is what we all know. So this is Bayer's universal type that was developed by him in 1925. This was the same year that he accepted Gropius's invitation to teach, which he did until 1928. Bayer became a master at the Bauhaus and began the new program in typography, heading up the new typographic workshop when the school moved from Weimar to Dessau. We see that Bayer's universal type consisted of a machine-age alphabet made of standardized geometric elements in a clean, still modern-looking format. Remember, this is 1925. Notice that it included only one set of letters, of lowercase, following the logic that since in speech there's no difference between a capital and small letter sound, there was no need for 2 written symbols. Bayer's streamlined sans-serif typefaces rejected the anachronistic tails on letters, those curly-cued remnants from handwriting. This was a dramatic change from German Gothic script. Bayer's graphics and typography were in tune with the international modernist avant-garde, demonstrating a simple geometric design, sans-serif type, and a predominant use of black and red. He was instrumental in changing the look of every pictorial and written graphic at the school, even designing the Bauhaus signage on Gropius's now famous Bauhaus building, in this case a unitary type of capital letters. This, of course, is the building at Dessau. And these are some recent photographs of Gropius's building. The building's a reinforced concrete skeleton with mushroom columns, wonderful glass curtained workshop spaces. In keeping with the Bauhaus ideal of integrating the arts, the interior decoration was executed by the wall painting workshop, the design and execution of all the lighting fixtures by the metal workshop, and the tubular furniture of steel for the building was executed from designs by Marcel Breuer's furniture workshop. Of course, again, the lettering by Bayer's printing workshop. I visited Dessau last summer during the Red Festival. Every year they have a different color. And here's how it looked. It was just fabulous. And here's another one of these. As the head of the typographic workshop, Bayer convinced Gropius to adopt the exclusive use of lowercase letters for all official Bauhaus typography, believing that a unitary type was so much more efficient for reading and writing, and of course for typesetting where only one set of letters was needed. I think Bayer would just love to see how many people today now use just lowercase in email correspondence for exactly the same reason. He would love it. Now, remember in German, where all the nouns are capitalized, this was a particularly radical thing to do. And I should mention that the Bauhaus was always viewed as a subversive element by the authorities anyway. And when the school in Dessau began using it with only lowercase letters, the Dessau post office refused to handle their mail because they said it just wasn't properly addressed. Just before leaving the Bauhaus, Bayer designed this 1927 cover of the January 1928 Bauhaus magazine. And here you can see that he integrated typography and photography to make a very sophisticated graphic design. He photographed a folded sheet of magazine print with the title Bauhaus on it and juxtaposed it with the geometric elemental forms associated with Bauhaus teaching. He moved to Berlin in 1928, and in Berlin he continued to juxtapose photography and typography in his graphic designs. It was a very, very innovative use of photomontage in graphic design in the 1930s. During this time, he experimented with images and techniques across media, in graphic design and typography, and also in exhibition design, along with painting and experimental photography. Working from and expanding Bauhaus ideas, he often borrowed devices from one medium and applied them to another. So paintings, photographs, and graphics often share similar imagery and logic. So you can see that clouds predominate not only in his photograph at the left, but also in his painting at the right, also in his graphics. So we have clouds going through all of these things. Bones were another favorite image, as we see in a painting at the left and a photograph at the right. Here are several images with a single subject remembered from his youth in Austria, the barn wall that was vented, of course, with openings to prevent heat from building up. And they were hung with farm implements. So now we have a photograph at left and an oil at the right, both from 1936, and a wall sculpture at left and two more paintings at right. Some of Bayer's paintings during the Berlin years include painted structural members that look like those of his exhibition partitions, and sometimes propped up letters like those he used in typography, which we also can see in his photography. In this photograph, the style, like that of Bayer's graphics, responds also to the aesthetics of painting. Many of his paintings of the time include surrealistic elements, disjunctures in space, and devices borrowed from photomontage, which of course add to their richness. Two works of 1939, Armory at left and Interstellar Communication at right, show his surrealist-inspired forms. In Berlin, he used photography both in his graphic design and also as an independent art medium. His first photographs were of objects or scenes, usually seen from unusual viewpoints or with distortions, or as in this example from 1929, a subject which alone provokes intrigue. Of course, this is called Glass Eyes. The eye is an image Bayer used throughout his career in many media, as we see in two later graphics done in the United States on the cover of his 1967 book and at right for an admissions ticket for the Art Directors Club of Chicago. And of course, in his 1932 photomontage, Lonely Metropolitan. And the Aspen-inspired later photomontage In Search of Times Past from 1959. The surrealist overtones of all these images are reaffirmed in his self-portrait, a photo montage again of 1932. In addition to here's the self-portrait. In addition to his photographs and photo montages, in Berlin, Bayer also made experimental photographs that he called photoplastiken. Unlike photo montages, these are not made by combining photographs, but instead are made by first photographing actual objects set up as a still life in the studio. Sometimes then he would go and erase or rework areas, add airbrush to add in various images. In the photoplastique at right, entitled Metamorphosis of 1936, we see that it's visually similar to the Belgian surrealist Magritte's oil painting, Mental Arithmetic, of 5 years earlier. Bayer moved to New York in 1938, and during the 1940s he became very much preoccupied with atmospheric and interstellar conditions, and also with the movements within the Earth's crust, particularly as they relate to mountains. Some paintings like this 1941 canvas, Interstellar Exchange, that on one level examine atmospheric upheavals, seem clearly to also relate to his own personal displacement and upheaval during the war years as an immigrant in America. The graphics he produced in New York City included a sophisticated use of photo montage, as we see in his advertisement for his own New York City design studio. Of course, that reflects and reminds us of Lonely Metropolitan. And he did the wonderful book jacket for Jose Luis Sert's book, Can Our Cities Survive? And in this, he photomontaged great crowds inside of a sardine can. In his graphics and typography, Bayer stressed visual communication in tune with the modern age. Besides calling for a unitary sans serif type, he proposed new book layouts and even new alphabetic symbols for such repeated letter groups as PH, CH, TH, and ING, again, kind of like what some text messages do today. He designed posters and advertisements with similar economy of design, pairing each composition to its essential with strong, unified image, replacing any overstated text. No matter how informative the text, it had to go out for the image. He sought a dynamic symmetry which carried the eye through a composition rather than a static axial symmetry. Closely related to Bayer's graphic design is his work in exhibition design, which, if you think about it, is like taking the flat graphic into three-dimensional extension. Again, Bayer stressed good visual communication, integrating graphic design, photography, and environmental design. Bayer's exhibition designs aim to create finite total environments that communicate to a viewer participant. In a sense, the exhibition hall is a self-contained microcosm of a well-designed world. And that slice of a well-designed world is just what he later was able to conceive and build here at the Aspen Institute, as we'll see in a minute. Within a short time after his 1938 move to New York, Bayer designed 3 exhibitions for the Museum of Modern Art, New York: Bauhaus 1919 to 1928 at left in 1938, The Road to Victory at the right in 1942, and Airways to Peace in 1943. Bayer's exhibitions emphasized the exhibition hall as a total environment, including, in addition to standard vertical walls, an integrated space which functioned as a dynamic environment for the interaction between people and what was exhibited. When he arrived in New York in 1938, it was absolutely revolutionary to think that a museum gallery could be more than a 4-walled static cube on whose vertical walls flat images are hung. Only 8 years earlier, in 1930, had Bayer himself devised his concept of a field of vision, which he diagrammed while collaborating with his former Bauhaus colleagues Gropius, Breuer, and Moholy-Nagy on the Deutscher Werkbund section of a 1930 exhibition held in Paris. His schematic drawing visualizes the idea that new possibilities can be explored by extending the field of vision to utilize more than flat vertical walls and then to add interest with this unexpected arrangements. I don't know how many of you have seen the Libeskind building at the Denver Art Museum. I wish Herbert Bayer could have. But this is the view into the 1930 exhibition that he worked on, displaying architecture and mass-produced furniture. We see furniture and photo panels angled out from the ceiling and wall. Certainly this arrangement relies on the previous diagram at the left for its logic. 5 years later, in 1935, Bayer diagrammed a further extension of vision, we can see at the right, by raising the viewer to an elevated viewing level on a ramp or platform. Added challenges present themselves with material simultaneously suspended at angles from the ceiling, tipped up from the wall and the floor, and of course hung on the wall for a dynamic gallery environment. His diagram describes what was in full use by an exhibition that he did with Gropius and Moholy-Nagy in 1931. Here we see an elevated visitor ramp that extends the viewer's field of vision for a bird's eye view of the entire hall, and by careful placement leads the viewer through a complete series of planned experiences in space and time. Giant photographs and montages were effective from distances, viewer participation encouraged by animation, peepholes, louvers, and manipulated displays. When he arrived in New York, Bayer was one of only a handful of artists who was experienced in these new exhibition techniques. And in New York, he introduced these principles in 3 major exhibitions for the Museum of Modern Art. In the midst of moving from Europe to the United States, Bayer organized and designed the landmark 1938 Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Bauhaus 1919 to 1928. The exhibition presented the American public with its first thorough view of the Bauhaus, and it demonstrated some of the latest principles of European display. Displays were tipped out away from the wall rather than sitting flush against it. Movable displays and peepholes encouraged visitor participation, and you can see that there were directional shapes painted on the floor guiding visitors through logical sequences. Bayer's next installation at New York's Museum of Modern Art, the 1942 Road to Victory, dealt with the growth of America and her philosophical war against fascism. This was a very popular, inspirational show meant to boost American morale during wartime. The exhibition was directed by the photographer Edward Steichen and the text written by his brother-in-law, the poet Carl Sandburg. Using only photo panels, Bayer achieved a dynamic effect by application of his principle of extension of vision. Visitors moved along elevated walkways to view huge photo panels angled up from the floor, hung from the ceiling, and positioned in group series for a very dynamic effect. In 1943, again at the Museum of Modern Art, Bayer designed the exhibition Airways to Peace, which emphasized how air travel was bringing the world's people closer together. In Airways to Peace, he was even more inventive in applying the concept of an extension of vision. As part of the exhibition, Bayer constructed a large suspended walk-in globe, creating an environment that would surround the viewer. Although globes avoid the inherent distortions of flat maps, when we look at a conventional globe, it curves away from us. It limits our vision to only a very small amount of geographic data at once. But by creating an outside-in globe, Bayer enabled the globe to curve around the viewer, extending his field of vision. For Bayer, exhibition design brought together 2 areas that were lifelong concerns: visual communication and environmental design. In 1945, while working on this exhibition for Container Corporation of America, Bayer first met Walter Pepke, chairman of Container Corporation. His friendship with Walter Pepke changed the course of his career and, of course, brought him to Aspen. Pepke hired Bayer to work for Container Corporation and also for the redevelopment of Aspen as a cultural educational center. By 1946, he had relocated to Aspen, reconnecting to the mountain kind of landscape that he had experienced in his youth. His interest in geologic phenomena sparked a series of lithographs and some paintings called convolutions. Here he examines the movements of mountains from both the inside and the out. In his huge 8-foot by 10-foot painting, Colorado Mural, he shows both the upheavals within the mountain and also the snow-peaked surface. This interest culminated in Bayer's project for Container Corporation, the design and editing of the World Geographic Atlas, which was privately published by Container Corporation in 1953. Bayer, who was not a scientist, researched, wrote, and designed this book, which was acclaimed in its day and has become the collector's item. He stressed in the title, by a hyphen between geo and graphic, that complicated scientific data could be clarified for lay readers by means of visually concise graphics, a revolutionary concept for the early 1950s. We've become so used to graphic charts and diagrams in our reference books and online that it's really hard to remember how revolutionary this was in 1953. All the time he worked in design, Bayer also continued to paint. In the 1950s, he re-examined Bauhaus issues of color and structure in paintings dealing with linear structure. In the next 2 decades, he developed his painting series, The Chromatics. The chromatics of the late 1960s and early 1970s are hard-edge paintings of pure color, and many of them rely on mathematically produced systems of proportion for their structure. A favorite of these is a Fibonacci progression. Bayer's last painting series of the late 70s and 80s contains some of the most interesting to my mind. Called the Anthologies, this series acts as a filtered compendium of ideas and forms that engage Bayer throughout his life. The hard edges here have given way to richly articulated surface treatment with very subtle coloration and a return to a handmade look. In this series, Bayer clearly makes reference to all his life's work in typography, graphic design, and environmental design. We see allusions to charts, to map making, typographic symbols, previous painting styles, environmental sculpture, and everything else that occupied his art and design. Some forms floating within ambiguously stated universes seem at times to refer to sun, moon, stars, and continents, as in his celebrated atlas. His work for the corporate community is very interesting because first for Container Corporation and then for Atlantic Richfield, he worked as a close friend and advisor to the top man in the company. Think about it, what an unusual role for an artist, and what a wonderful relationship that they had. Bayer's prominent role in the early years of the Aspen Institute, where artists and businessmen met on equal ground, helped forward the cause of good design within American business. Container Corporation's graphic campaign, The Great Ideas of Western Man, took a new approach to corporate advertising. Rather than promoting a product, the corporation sold good ideas for the betterment of society, and in the process sold its image as a forward-thinking company. This was an absolutely innovative approach to advertising in the 1950s when it was introduced. Walter Pepka died in 1960, and by 1966, Bayer turned his services to the Atlantic Richfield Company, headed by Robert O. Anderson, whom he'd known here in Aspen. As the art and design consultant for ARCO, Bayer implemented his concept of total integrated design throughout the company. He directed all corporate graphics, acquisition for its extensive art collection, and the design and decoration of its worldwide offices. He even worked on proposals for the beautification of an oil refinery. Unfortunately, it was never approved. I guess I've skipped here. Let's see if I can figure out. This is what they told me to do to go back. Here we go. It doesn't seem to want to stick back there. On the left is a wall of louvers for the ARCO boardroom in Los Angeles, and it used ordinary slatted blinds. I mean, we didn't have to get into something totally fabricated. And of course, the wonderful Bayer carpet. At the right is Chairman Anderson's office. And here is that proposal for the ARCO oil refinery that was going to screen the ugly drums from a highway view. And of course, Bayer's sculpture Double Ascension for what was then ARCO Plaza in Los Angeles of 1972 to 73. It's still standing there. One of my favorite works is Bayer's walk-in space painting, sited at the Breakers, which was the former ARCO Executive Training Center in Santa Barbara. This work really serves in many different ways. It works as an environment, and it operates between painting, sculpture, and architecture. Since from a distance you see it as sculpture, its tile decoration looks much like a mural painting, and you can walk through its members like architecture. Beyer has been remarkably inventive in the area that I like to call designing human spaces. These spaces include the corporate architectural complexes, those of exhibition design, as well as outdoor sculptural designs for parks, highways, even surf sculpture to slow the erosion along the Southern California coast. And of course, the project for which he's best known, the development here in Aspen at this Aspen Institute complex. In 1946, Walter Pepka invited Beyer to Aspen, then a mostly abandoned mining town, as we saw this morning. Here, Beyer saw opportunity for applying his concept of integrated design on large scale. His design skills were called upon for every conceivable use, from promoting the new town and its skiing opportunities with posters, advertisements, brochures, even stationery and menus, to actually devising a plan for the refurbishing of the old town and the construction of the new Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies campus. In these two posters from 1946, Beyer again combined photography and typography in a graphic solution that still looks modern more than 60 years later. Here are some early travel brochures he did for Aspen and stationery. In many ways, this must have been like a Bauhaus dream to build a well-designed community. As I see it, everything that Beyer had done before with exhibition design, with graphic design, with murals, sculpture, all came into play as he sought to create a unified environment here at the Aspen Institute, where, as at the Bauhaus, all the arts were unified into an integrated, total environment. Though some original structures, of course, have been replaced over the years, Beyer's integrated large-scale design still lives here, and it has been brought into the future as the Aspen Institute matures gracefully into the 21st century. Here's some of the clean line primary colors in the original housing for the Aspen Meadows. These buildings, of course, have been replaced, as has the Beyer Benedict Music Tent, but none of these was ever really meant to be permanent. Here's the interior of the original tent. This is not the original, it's the second tent, because you heard this morning that Saarinen, of course, did the first one. We also, across the way, can see the wall with Sgraffito mural here at the Koch Seminar Building, again from 1953. Beyer learned the Sgraffito technique at the Bauhaus. A dark layer of plaster is overlaid with light-colored plaster, and while still wet, the top layer is scratched through to expose the dark one. And so his friends helped him to create this mural late at night. Beyer designed the health center. Whoops, here's one more. I got very excited with a digital camera the other day. Beyer designed the health center with clear integrated lettering in primary colors. And I thought you might enjoy not only seeing the health center, but some of these early photographs of this Pepke Memorial building. As part of his total design, in 1955, Beyer created his grass mound here at the Aspen Meadows complex. This monument of molded earth was created a full decade before the term earthwork was ever known or spoken. In fact, Beyer has been hailed as a precursor by the next generation, the younger earthwork artists. He designed the mound as a human space to be enjoyed, to be sat in, and played on. Here are some of the beautiful drawings he did working on the idea of molded earth. During the 1970s, the early 70s, Beyer continued these ideas in the larger molded earth park, Anderson Park, named for Robert O. Anderson, Beyer's good friend and associate, who of course was chairman of ARCO and of the Board of Trustees of the Aspen Institute. The mounds and resources still form a beautiful foil for the nearby mountain scenery, while providing an inviting walk-through environment, and I guess some fabulous weddings was what I saw last night. Beyer's marble garden, like the grass mound nearby, was created in 1955. He collected remnants of marble found at the nearby quarry in Marble, Colorado, and he set them up as a kind of found object park for relaxation. And here is the original sighting of the Kaleidoscreen of 1956, originally sited near the swimming pool at the Aspen Meadows, and now beautifully restored and sited on a piece of grass nearby. This served not only as sculpture but also as practical protection from wind and sun. Individual louvers are movable, changing both pattern and effectiveness in function as they're moved by the cranking mechanism. In creating human spaces, Bayer's primary interest was always how his designs would function for people. He saw his work as an integral part of the larger human context and his belief in total design. But in Aspen, he also could enjoy the expressive, playful, and informal, as in these birdhouses he made in 1953 for wounded owls that actor Gary Cooper had rescued, and his many private responses to the natural beauty of Aspen that no doubt reminded him of his native Austria. Here are some sketches he made of mountains, butterflies, wildlife, leaves. Some of these were made up on the top of Independence Pass. Just extraordinary. Again, this expressive, personal aspect that so many people who've never been to Aspen don't know about Herbert Bayer. So I believe that Bayer always maintained these two sides, the private, expressive, and the public, functional. The Aspen Institute campus today is proof of Bayer's commitment to the Bauhaus idea of total design, where every well-designed part works together. He applied his creative energies in diverse ways. He is relevant today because not only did he pioneer the design of this great place, but because he was a model of mind, body, spirit, the tenets of the Aspen Institute that still live on. Although Bayer left the Bauhaus at the age of only 28, his activities for the following 5 decades were guided by Bauhaus ideas and Bauhaus ideals also. Even late in life, when Bayer, by his own admission, would have preferred to seclude himself in the studio and paint, he continued to direct his energies to what he believed is the artist's responsibility to the rest of us in society, to integrate good design into everyday life. These contributions enrich the entire fabric of American art and design, and much of that story happened here at the Aspen Institute. Thank you.